Hi, I'm Tim. I'm one of the co-founders of CodePath. If you're watching this video, you're considering taking one of our iOS classes, and I wanted to give you a little bit of a teaser of what it's like to develop in iOS by building a simple application together. The app that we're going to build is a simple tip calculator. You just enter the bill amount, and it'll tell you how much you want to tip. If you are eating with friends, then it'll tell us how much you each owe, and we can choose our tip level here. So this app, we were having some fun with some of the colors and some really simple animations, which you'll find very easy. But to get started, we're going to do a stripped down, simpler version, which works essentially the same. Just type in your bill amount here, and you can see what your tip is, as well as adjust your tip amount here. To get started, let's create an Xcode project. So go ahead and open Xcode and click File, New Project. And then we'll select a single view app. You're always going to select a single view app in your future Xcode projects. Not all of these are just kind of demos for you to look at. And so single view app, and I'm going to just choose some app name. You can choose anything you want here and click next. So the first thing to do just off the bat is to go ahead and launch your application. And so you can choose any number of phones here. I like to choose the iPhone 8 because it runs well on my computer. It just changes the size a little bit, but the iPhone 8 is a little bit faster and easier to run. And so just hit play here to start running your first application. You're just gonna see a white screen at first, so it's a little bit anticlimactic, but it's kind of cool to see the iPhone right here. And so the first thing that you do when you build an iOS application is you're gonna receive a set of mocks from your designer. And so the first thing that you do is you lay out the elements of each screen. So here's just a really boring white screen. And so for us, we're going to click on this file right here. It's the main.storyboard. This is where the graphical design of your application lives. And so it's kind of a drag and drop interface. And so at first you see there's only one screen, and it's that same white screen that launched. And then in your application, you're going to have a bunch of screens here. And for us, we're going to start to drag the elements of our screen on here that our designer gave us. So just for reference, I'm going to open up our application again and take a look. These are all labels here. And this thing is called a text field. This is something that a user can type into. This view right here is called a segmented control. It's what iOS has for switching between options. So this is their radio control. And so let's start to kind of recreate this screen. I'm going to click on this icon over here. This thing is your objects library. And if you type in label here, then label will come up and you can start to drag this element in. You can also use the shortcut key Command-Shift-L, and that will bring this up again. And I can type in text field to bring in my next element. So this is what I'm going to use in order to accept user input. Now, if you look on the left-hand side here, you can see that these elements are starting to be added in here, kind of indented in. So this thing right here is your primary view. Every screen here is called a view controller. You're going to have a bunch of screens in your application. Each one's called a view controller. You have a different view controller for each one. And each one's going to have this main view that is this whole screen, and then everything else is going to be contained inside of it. So in this view area here, everything here is actually a view. It's just that some of these are specialized view. So if I could click on this label, for example, if I scroll down here, I can see that all views have certain things in common. They can all change their background color. They can all change their opacity. They have a lot of other properties related to the view. And then the more specialized types have additional properties. And so if I click around here on the screen, then this area right here goes with whatever I have actively selected. So if I'm clicking on the label right now, so I see the label properties. And then if I click on this text field, then I can see the text field properties. I can justify this. If I click on the view here, I can see again that I can change its properties here. I can also bring in other views. So if I type in UI view, so this is just the kind of the base type, And all this is a rectangle. So views are just rectangles with these properties. And so if I change this to a different color so I can see it, I can see this rectangle here. And then every view, just like this main view here, can contain other views. So for example, I can move this label inside this view for whatever reason. And so you can see that this label becomes a child of this view in here. And the reason for this is because, one, it's just to be organized. And so an average screen will have things that kind of belong together, but then it has a lot of other neat features too, which is if I move this parent view, then all of its children move with it. And so if you're doing a cool animation, then this kind of card can all move together. And it's just a way to be organized. So once you have this basically configured, I'm going to run this and let's see what happens. So you can see once you run the app that it's pretty cool that whatever you designed here in Storyboard is what appears here. If you've ever done HTML or CSS before, you can see that this is much easier in comparison. Now there's a gotcha, which is that, of course, there are many different phone sizes. And so if you're just laying it out here, well, how do you think this is going to look if this runs on a bigger phone or a smaller phone? So later on the actual class, we're going to learn about something called auto layout, which is a set of rules that you specify to this that says, hey, if you're running on a bigger phone, then stay centered, or maybe you should grow bigger when you're on a bigger phone. And so you specify those rules on each view to specify how they should behave. Once you're at this stage though, let's go ahead and finish building out what the tip calculator should look like. So we're almost there. Now the only thing that we're missing is this segmented control. The way you configure segmented controls is just you choose how many segments or options you want, and for us it's just 3. And then this selector specifies which of these you're editing. So we have segment 0 at 15%, segment 2, let's say it's 18%, and then for the final segment, we'll have it at 20%. All right, so that's looking pretty reasonable. And if you notice, the tip calculator had a little bar at the top. That's called a navigation bar. The way that you add a navigation bar in iOS is you actually click on the view controller, and then there's a button here which is embed in navigation controller. So it's this icon right here that has an arrow down here, and then you can say embed in navigation controller. So we're going to get into what this is later in the class. This is one of the ways that you switch between screens in iOS. And you'll notice that if you think about it, most applications that you see in iOS has this top bar area, which kind of gives you the hint that most screens in iOS have this navigation controller. So once you do this, you can also set the title of this area here. So you click on this navigation item and then just type in the title here. So I'll just type in tip calculator. And let's just give that a final run. So now we have a screen that looks a little bit like the app I showed you earlier. Now that we've built our basic screen, I wanted to show you this website. So this is a mobile pattern site. There's a lot of them. These are sites that designers go to when they want to check out what a lot of different apps look like so they can kind of get an idea for new designs for the apps that they're building. And this is a great way to check out a bunch of different applications at the same or really efficiently. So what I wanted to show you is look at how different a lot of these apps look like. And yet, if you look carefully at the components within them, you'll start to know quickly that these are using a lot of the same controls. And so, for example, you see a lot of text, right? So those are labels that we already used. We see a lot of images. We see buttons. If we kept on scrolling, we might find an embedded map. And we notice that a lot of these are within scrolling lists. So for example, a lot of these you can imagine that if you were launching this app that you could scroll it. And that's something that we would learn how to build right away in our class. So the moral of the story is that in iOS, as you're building these screens, first you're using a relatively small number of different types. And that's kind of cool because once you learn how to build one screen in iOS, it means that you're well on your way to being able to build a lot of other screens. Okay, so back to building our application. So we finished the screen layout and now it's time to start adding the correct behavior. If I tap inside of this text field to type my bill amount, you can see that this keyboard comes up automatically. That's just a feature of iOS. You don't manually bring up the keyboard or dismiss the keyboard. Instead, it's kind of if you focus in this area, if you tap in this area as a user, the keyboard just automatically shows up. Now, sometimes it's a bug, but in your simulator, the keyboard doesn't come up, and that's just because of the simulator bug. You would come over here to hardware and then keyboard, and you can manually toggle it here. So Command K. But if you run this on your phone, then the keyboard will always come up. So the first thing that I might want to do is to configure this keyboard so it's the number pad instead. The way that you do that is you go to the text field here and you go to the properties and you can see a bunch of different options here. So this controls what keyboard shows up as well as other behaviors once a user selects this one. So for example, if this were a password, then if I toggle secure text entry, it turns it into those dots that you're familiar with. And so let's go to the keyboard type, which is right here, and I'll just change it to a decimal pad. And now once I run this again, once I select that text field, it's going to be numbers. Now, let's say that we want to dismiss the keyboard once the user taps on it. And so like, for example, we want to add our first piece of logic. And so if I tap in here, then the keyboard shows up and that's great and I'm happy with this. But now as a user, I want this keyboard to go away. So I want to make it so that if I touch in this area or anywhere in here, that keyboard goes away. So the moment that we want to start adding logic like this, now we need to go to Swift, which is a language you probably don't know yet, but that's okay. We're going to learn that in this class. Now, every screen in iOS is a view controller. And so you're going to have, say, 12 view controllers in your app once you finish building it. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to this viewcontroller.swift file. This is going to have the Swift code that's associated with this default screen. And you're going to create a new view controller file for new screens that come up. So just for now, though, we'll use the one that was given to us by default. And what we're going to do is we're going to bring in a new element here. So go ahead and hit Command-Shift-L or click this button to bring up the library. And then we're going to bring in a tap gesture recognizer. So for mobile apps, as you know, users touch them. And the way that you kind of figure out what the user is doing, whether they're tapping, which is the most common. So most of the time you're using the tap gesture recognizer, but there's also the pinch gesture recognizer, the rotate gesture recognizer, the pan gesture recognizer for more advanced controls. However, for now, we're just going to do tap. And so I'm going to drag this around. And you can see, I'm not letting go, by the way. You can see that as I drag around, it's highlighting different things. So what this means is if I were to drop this on this little bar right here, this view, that means that when the user taps here, it's going to do something. So what I want to do is I want to drop it on this main view here because I want something to happen anytime the user taps in this main area. And so this tap gesture recognizer gets added right here. If I right click on this, then I can see that this is associated, you see the view that it's highlighting? It's associated with that view. So if I accidentally clicked on the wrong one, then you can click on this X and drag it to another view. So what I want to do now is I'm going to bring this Swift file into view here by clicking this double rings icon. So this is the assistant editor. And so just side by side, here's my view, and then this is the logic that gets run with it. Now, it's not important to know what a lot of these words mean, right? So we don't care what import means. We don't care what override or super means. So what we're just trying to do is get a gist of things. And so if I control drag from this file into the Swift file, this is how we start to link the things that are happening in Storyboard with what's happening in Swift. And so what we want is we want an action. In other words, when I tap, I want you to do something. So I'm going to type the name of my function here. It's going to just be on tap. And so if you just click in here, whatever you type in here is the code that's going to run when a user taps. And so let's just illustrate this by typing something simple. I'm just going to print hello here. So once you print something, then it appears in this console area. So you see these kind of window panes right here. I'm going to just hide this left one for now because we don't need it. This area right here is the console output. So you see all these messages right here. These are these are warning messages. Actually, these are normal messages that you'll probably see as well, and you can just ignore them. However, your messages also appear in this area. So for example, if I'm clicking in this screen now, you see that hello that appeared. I can click here an arbitrary number of times. It's going to keep on printing out hello. So anything that I type in here now is going to get run once you tap in this screen. And so what I'd like to do is let's dismiss that keyboard. I'd like to on tap dismiss that keyboard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the code for dismissing a keyboard. Now, iOS developers, they use autocomplete like crazy. And so part of learning iOS development is just learning how autocomplete works. So I'm just going to type in view. So I just VI. And the view here is referring to this main view that comes with your view controller. So I can scroll down. So just practice using the autocomplete and then hit enter to accept that autocomplete option. And then you hit dot in order to do things either to that view. So I can say view.background color to change the background color. I can say view dot, and there's functions related to each view as well. And so I say, hey, view.end editing. That says that's how in iOS you dismiss the keyboard. And so force means sometimes it doesn't want to end, but I'm going to say, hey, no matter what you say, go ahead and end editing. And this should dismiss the keyboard. So once we run it again, then I come over here and I select the text field. Keyboard comes up. I click anywhere in here. My hello gets output into the console, and I can see my keyboard goes away. So that's our first piece of functionality in the application. Pretty cool. All right, so let's get to the main functionality. So the main functionality is if I type a bill amount here, then I expect this tip and total label to be updated. So in order to do that, I need to do a couple things. One, I need to run a function when I type in here. Two, I need to be able to get the value of the bill. Three, I need to be able to calculate the tip. And four, I need to be able to update these labels based on those things. So in iOS, like open up any application that you have right now, you'll notice that if you're not touching the app, nothing's happening, generally speaking. And so what does that mean? In iOS, everything starts with an action. So you notice that nothing happened until I actually engaged this tap gesture recognizer. So in iOS, all code usually starts with an action. So the action here is going to be, if I right click on this text field, I can see these things here. These are all called events. So these are all the things that I can do something as a result of. Now there's a lot of options. However, touch up inside is the most commonly used one. Editing changed is the one that we're going to use now. So every time the user types in a new number into that bill, I'm going to update. I want my function to be called, and I want my tip and total to be updated. So I'm just going to drag again into this file so that it creates a new action. And I'm going to say calculate tip. So this will be the name of my function. I'm just going to hit enter to have this auto create. I'll go ahead and close this. And if I just select the view controller here, I'll make the storyboard go away so that we have a little bit more room to work. So every time the user taps in that bill field, this function is going to get run. So again, the things that I want to do here are get the bill amount, calculate the tip and total, update the tip and total labels. So if I could somehow do these things, then I would be done. So let's start backwards. Let's start with this last task right here, which is to somehow update the tip and total labels. I'm going to go back to my storyboard here. And in order to accomplish this task, I need to be able to communicate in different ways with the elements here. So I need to be able to call them by some name. So I'm going to bring back the double rings here. And we're going to do something called creating outlets. So I'm going to scroll to the top of the file here, and then I'm going to control drag from these labels into this file. So I'm just going to put them at the top here. Now, you create an outlet anytime you want to be able to access a view element in the storyboard. So by access, I mean, for example, for the text field, I want to be able to get a number out of it. For the tip label, I want to be able to update its text field. So I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it tip label. And so the convention here is you end it with the type that it is. And so this is just a rule to make it easier for you to remember. So it's tip label here. And I'll also create the total label. And then I'll also create the bill field. So now that I have my labels, I'll go back to the view controller. I'll make this assistant editor go away. So I have my labels here and my bill field. Don't worry about what IB outlet, week, all of this stuff means. Just conceptually, these are the names of the things that I created. And if I want to be able to access them or modify them, then I just refer to them here. So if you scroll down to updating the tip and total labels, I can say tip label. And just like I did for view, if I hit dot, all my options are going to come up here. So if I type in text, this is what I use to change what this will display. And so for example, I can just say $10, just to give you a feeling for how to modify this. I'll just change it to a static number, and later we'll figure out how to update it. And so if I run this, then what I want to have happen is whenever I edit in that bill field, I expect $10 and $110 to appear inside the tip and total label. So just type something in here. You can press here, or you can also just type using your keyboard. And I can see, sure enough, once I typed, then I have the 10 and the 110 show up, which is great. So now I can work on the other aspects, which is I need to know what the amount was, and I need to actually calculate what the tip and total is so I can update it properly. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to type let bill is equal to, and so let is what Swift calls a variable, and so you use let or var. Let you use is something if you don't change again, so it's called a constant. So let bill is equal to bill amount, or bill field, sorry, bill field.text. We're going to learn more about this in the class, but there's something in Swift called optionals. And so for now, what that means is that for reasons you don't understand, you occasionally need to put exclamations after things or question marks after things. And so it's something that we'll unpack later, but for now, just put a question mark there. Now, the problem with this is that text, as it sounds, is text. And so it's not a number. It's not something that you can do math with. And so we have to change this to a number. So similar to other languages that you might have used, numbers for some reason, historical reason, are called doubles. So I'm going to put this in parentheses, double parentheses, and that will change this thing into a number. Now, the user can type something in there that's not a valid number, or they can paste something in there that's not a valid number. And so how do we handle that case? If you use this notation, question mark, 0. So question mark means everything to the left of the question mark, if it's not valid, then just change it to 0. So go ahead and type that. And then now that I have the bill as a number, I want to create variables for my tip and my total. So type let tip is equal to bill times 0.1. We're going to change this later so that it depends on what the user selects. But for now, we're just going to keep it a static 0.1. And then I'll create a let total is equal to bill plus tip. So now we've created more variables where it calculates our tip and our total. And so our final thing is we need to update this so that it's not the number, but it's the variable that we placed here. So the way that we use variables is I'm going to delete this. I'm going to leave the question mark. but I'm used to use notation where I have backslash, open parentheses, close parentheses. So when you have that backslash, open parentheses, close parentheses, it's expecting you to put a variable in here. So if you put tip, it's not actually going to put tip here, but it's going to take a variable that you call tip, and then it's going to print it out here. So it's going to be $ and the actual tip amount. And then similarly here, we'll do backslash total. And so if we run this, then we've actually implemented the basic functionality of our application. So let's give it a try. I'm going to type in 100 right here, and I can see that it's working. Except that we have a few small, just polished details. First, this is left justified, so that's kind of weird. And second, this has only one number after the period, which is also kind of weird. I want it to have two, like a normal number. So let's fix those two little items there. I'll go back to the storyboard, and I'll select my text field again, and I'll go back to properties, and I'll see that, okay, cool, I can right justify this. And so that'll fix that problem. And then if I go back to view controller, so this is a pretty handy format where I can just use this backslash parentheses. If I want to do something more sophisticated, like what I currently want to do, then if I type string open parentheses, there's a couple of functions here that I can use. If I do type the word format, and I select this first one by hitting enter, then the way that I use this is you specify your format string here. So $, and then you're going to put special symbols here that will be replaced by your variables. So they start with a %. So that's kind of weird to get used to. But if you do %F, that means that this thing will be replaced by some number. And so the things that you can have here are tip. And then, for example, if you had a bunch of things that you can embed, anytime you have a %, say F for a decimal number, D for an integer, use @ if it's a string, and then that would then expect more variables here. But for us, it's just one, so it's just going to be %F, and in this case, it's going to be the tip. So we're going to do the same thing for the total as well. And then let's see what that gives us. So I'll just copy and paste this, type in total, and run this again. So I'll type in 100 here, and I see that, well, we're kind of nuts. Now it printed out a bunch of numbers, but we're on the right track. And so as part of this special notation, you can configure how it formats numbers. So if I do 0.2, what that actually means is, hey, I want 2 decimal places for this number. So now if I do 0.2f, and if I run it again, let's see what happens. So I'll type 100 in here, and I see that now this is formatted nicely. And so the final feature that I want to add is I want to be able to configure the tip percentage. So when I tap on this thing, I want it to change percentages, and I also want to respect whatever it is that it's on. So in order to do that, I need to make it so that this isn't 0.1, but that this is something contingent on what the user has selected. So in order to do that, I'm going to introduce another concept here. I'm going to introduce a Swift array, which is like a list of things. So percentages is equal to, and you use a bracket for an array. So I'll say, well, it's either going to be 0.1, 0.18, or 0.2. So it's one of those 3 options. And so the way that you access elements in this array is I say tip percentages, and then you use brackets and say 0, 1, or 2. So 0 is going to be 0.1, 1 it's going to be 0.18, and then 2 is going to be 0.2, or 1 is 0, 1, 2. And so if I just do 0, then it's still always going to select 0.1. So I don't want this to be 0. I want this to be the index that I actually selected. So once again, I'm going to need to create another outlet. So double rings again here. Scroll around, click on this segmented control, and just like before, I'm going to control drag and select an outlet. So I'm going to type this in. I'm going to call this tip control. So not only do I want to use tip control to select which tip value I have. If a user taps in here, I also want this function to be called again. So just like I did for this build field, I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to see all those options again. And in this case, for the segmented control, it's the value changed event. So every time a user taps on one of these, the value changed event is called. And so I'm going to drag this. And the cool thing about iOS is you can actually reuse functions in this way. So now both of those things are tied to this particular function. So I'll go ahead and save this. And then instead of 0 here, so let me bring this back to the view controller. Instead of 0 here, I want to say, hey, tip control. Right, so it's not going to be .text like the other case. It's going to be .selected segment index. And this value is going to be either 0, 1, or 2, depending on what the user has selected. So let's run that and see what happens. So the first thing that we might want to fix is this label by default. It says label. Maybe we want to have something more reasonable by default. But if I type in 100, then it's going to be 10 and 110. And now if I click around, then I can see that this is being updated. So actually, this wasn't 10%, this was 15%. So I just need to update this by saying 0.15, and then that will be correct. So my maybe final cleanup is come back to this label, configure it to have some default value, which doesn't say label. Maybe it just says 0, and then maybe the total here is 0 as well. And that's it. We've built our first iOS application. So let's go back to the view controller and just kind of summarize what we have here. Now, this is the anatomy of every piece of logic that you're going to have in a view controller. So you're going to have one view controller file for every screen that you have in your iOS app. And you're going to maybe have 6 to 12 screens for the average application. You're going to have all of these things up here. They're called outlets. They refer to elements of your screen that you want to be able to configure. And you're going to want to configure, like, for example, if you're building Airbnb, that you're going to have this nice looking image view of your place. And so you're going to have, say, an image view here that you're going to want to change the image of. Same with text labels, text fields. So you're always going to have a pile of outlets at the top of your file here. That is what you want to be able to control. Then you're going to have a pile of actions. So everything in iOS starts off from a user action. And then there you're going to start to apply your logic, whether it's something local like this tip calculator, or it's going to create some kind of network event. Like if I double tap on something, then it's going to Instagram like, so it's going to make a network request to say, hey, like this post. But otherwise, that's the fundamental structure of iOS. And so that was your first tip calculator. You can follow some of the optional steps to add some more features, but this is the basic feature set.